Good evening, friends. The book I want to discuss this evening is called Jefferson's Pillow: The Founding Fathers and the Dilemma of Black Patriotism by Roger Wilkins. The book was published by Beacon Press in 2001. Now, this is a book that looks at four founding fathers in particular: Thomas Jefferson, most well known for being the author of the Declaration of Independence; James Madison, one of the principal architects of the United States Constitution; George Washington, who of course led the Revolutionary Army and subsequently became the first president of the United States; and George Mason, I think the least well-known, as Wilkins himself says, of all of these four figures, the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the principal force behind the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution known as the Bill of Rights. These four also had the distinction of being from the state of Virginia. And so this is, in some ways, also a book about how American slavery was invented in Virginia, something that I don't think is really discussed in common circles, although this is well known really to scholars. There is an epithet in the beginning, an epigraph, in the beginning, and this is from William Faulkner. "The past is never dead. In fact, it's never past." There are two others as well, but I mentioned this one because one of the things that, of course, Wilkins argues, and I think this is in some respects well known, and that is that the oppression of the black person is a story that is far from being over, most unfortunately. Slavery, in the formal sense of the term, of course, disappeared some time ago in the United States, but the condition of the black person remains precarious. However, Wilkins is arguing from the standpoint of an African American. And I think that one of the things that he wants to highlight in this little book is that although he is profoundly aware of the American past, and though he is someone who deplores, of course, the treatment of his own people, that nonetheless, unlike someone like Malcolm, who said that I can never really be an American, Roger Wilkins says that I feel American to the core. Every bone in my body is American. Thus, I think you get what is really the exploration of the principal exploration behind this book in some ways, although that really comes out only in the last, let's say, 20, 30, 40 pages, and that is the kind of paradox that the United States evokes, particularly in a thinking black person. All right? So as he says on page 6, "When I am abroad, I feel profoundly American, and I must look that way too." He says that he's often been in African countries, and without having said a thing, he is almost invariably identified as an African American. Right? But let's go back to the first two-thirds of the book, because the first two-thirds of the book is really looks at the lives of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and George Mason. And as Wilkins rightly reminds us, these were Englishmen. These four men were born Englishmen. They saw themselves as subjects of the English king. George Mason, for example, was profuse in fact, declaring his loyalty to the crown. This was, of course, some years before the events of the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. And so this is what George Mason, there is now a university, of course, called George Mason University, which in the Washington, D.C. area, which is named after him. In a letter that he writes in 1766, this is less than 10 years before the first shots were fired, of course, in Lexington and Concord. He could define himself as, quote, a man who spends most of his time in retirement and has seldom meddled in public affairs, who enjoys a moderate but independent fortune and content with the blessings of a private station, equally disregards the smiles and frowns of the great, who, though not born within the verge of the British Isle, is an Englishman in his principles, a zealous assertor of the Act of Settlement, firmly attached to the present royal family upon the throne, unalienably affected to His Majesty's sacred person and government, in the defense of which he would shed the last drop of his blood, who adores the wisdom and happiness of the British Constitution. There was no written constitution, but he's speaking about what is usually referred to as the unwritten constitution of the United Kingdom. And he continues to write in this vein. So I think that this is a very interesting point that we often lose sight of, namely that when we think of Jefferson, George Mason, Washington, and Madison, we have to remember that there were Virginians. These were men who were, in fact, actually very much loyal to the crown until a certain turn of events made that loyalty difficult and suspect. Right? Now, Wilkins goes on to describe the whole system of not simply slavery, very briefly, but he also describes the system of indentured labor. I think that some of his understanding is not entirely accurate, but by and large, for example, in his understanding of what is called the Statute of Artificers, also known as the Statute of Apprentices, which was passed in 1563 and was the law until 1819 in England. This was a law that was designed to banish idleness, and it subjected indentured servants, which included, of course, white people, right? In fact, most of the indentured servants were principally white. The black people were taken into slavery. These indentured servants were subjected to 7-year terms and could be bought and sold, much like slaves could be, although they were bought and sold far less frequently than were black people. Right? But he talks about, for example, the working days that they had, and it seems to me that, the extraordinary long working days that he mentions. But of course, we have to keep in mind that long working days were in fact very common, even 300 years later in the period of the Industrial Revolution. So I think his precise understanding of this act is not entirely accurate, but the gist of it follows and is true. Because what he's really trying to suggest is that, look, the matter of race is critically important, but there's also a matter of class here. Because it was not only black people who were subjected to oppression, the elite whites, upper class white people, subjected their own poor to absolutely degrading treatment, right? And I think that this is unquestionably the case. What he's saying here is something that is borne out by a very substantial amount of literature. Now, someone like George Mason, as George Wilkins points out, complained about the fact that there was an unequal relationship between Englishmen in the colonies and Englishmen back home in Britain. He writes a letter to the Committee of London Merchants, and I quote here, "The epithets of parent and child have been so long applied to Great Britain and her colonies that individuals have adopted them, and we rarely see anything from your side of the water, free from the authoritative style of a master to a schoolboy. Right? So his fundamental complaint here is that there is a tendency for the elites in Britain to see people like Mason, who himself is an elite back in the colonies, as a schoolboy. Right? The relationship here is one of tutelage. And this is, of course, extraordinarily interesting because these same people, Mason, and then he's going to bring Washington and Jefferson into the picture. He starts with, into the discussion, he starts off with Mason. All of these people were people who, of course, even though while they complained in some ways of the kind of oppression that they were now beginning to experience from the elites back in England, all of these people were, as Wilkins is going to point out, slave owners. They had, in some respects, no fundamental problem with that, right? Although there will be a number of occasions where, as Wilkins is going to show, where Jefferson in particular attempted to think through the whole question of slavery, and that the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, which was rejected, right, did in fact address this question of whether it was in fact at all appropriate to declare independence and to say that all men are born equal, right, and that everyone has the right to pursuit of liberty and happiness. And yet this word all evidently did not, of course, include black people. Right? So this is what he's going to lead up to. But in the first, let's say 30, 40, 50 pages of the book, he has really a discussion of the condition of what you might describe the plantation class or the rich white men. George Washington, let us not forget, was quite possibly the richest person in the United States, right, at the time of the Revolutionary War. And what he's doing here is that in this portion of the book, the first third of the book, he is offering a sociological kind of profile of dominant white society, and suggesting the kind of violence that was par for the course, especially if we look at the treatment that was handed out to not only black people, but also to American Indians. And he suggests a particular moment, which I don't think he furnishes enough evidence for that, but he suggests a particular moment where he says that we can think about the institutionalization of race and racism, that this particular moment marks the origin of that. And this is what is known as Nathaniel Bacon's Rebellion, which took place in 1675-76. So this is, of course, before the time of George Mason, Washington, and the others. We're speaking here roughly a century before, of course, the Declaration of Independence. Now, 40% of Virginia is going to be black by approximately 1700. 40%, right? And there are going to be restrictions that are going to be imposed on the mobility of black people, on their ability to be able to own firearms. This is going to be the Act of 1680. And what he says is that black people did not fall under the umbrella of what is known as human rights. Now, we will leave aside for the moment the whole question of whether the use of that expression, human rights, is not in some ways anachronistic, because I think that this is a relatively modern kind of discourse. There is certainly a discourse of rights. There is a right to property, and of course black people were the property of slave owners. But I think the conception of human rights as we talk about it today, because he's writing very much from the standpoint of today and in the vein of today, and I think that there is a certain kind of element of anachronism in speaking about the lack of human rights that certain people had. I mean, it's, of course, we understand the intent with which he is saying this, but black people were not the only people who were not the beneficiaries of human rights. The substantial portion of the human race was not the beneficiaries of human rights at this point in time. Now, he goes on to sort of look at Mason and Washington and Jefferson subsequently, and makes some very interesting observations. So, for example, on page 32, it's not so much, again, a particularly novel observation, but sometimes what happens is that one overlooks these kinds of things. So he's saying here that when Mason is taking part in this kind of discourse where they're beginning to discuss questions of human equality and freedom, Wilkins says, when Mason proclaimed human equality and freedom, he was aiming his words at those who exercise power over him, not dropping down a welcoming cloak in which to enfold those over whom he exercised power. In this, he was absolutely a typical member of his class. Right? So, yes, he is disturbed by the fact that people like him are not given the respect that he thinks he deserves from white elites who are over him. But when he's speaking about equality, he's not at all worried about whether people below him may well have the same thought about him. Right? That's what Wilkins, of course, is really pointing out. Now, from here he goes on to the Declaration of Independence. He begins to discuss Jefferson, and he begins to discuss the 1770s, and subsequent to the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, some brief discussion of the drafting of the Constitution, and before this, in 1775, the circumstances under which George Washington is going to take charge of the armies of the colonies in rebellion against the crown. So this is going to be on 3rd July 1775. At this point in time, 20% of the population of the colonies. We have to be very careful that we do not confuse this figure, 20%, with the population of the United States, because that would have, well, there was no United States, right? But 20% of all the people living there, because this 20% figure that I'm giving, when I say that 20% of all people living in the colonies, that is 20% of all Americans were black. This does not include American Indians. But we're saying if you're looking at the total population of white people and black people, 20% of that was, in fact, black. And very interestingly, something that I wasn't aware of initially, but when George Washington took over, was given command of the army, he refused to take the services of black people. He said that black people would not be inducted into the armed forces. The colonial governor, representing the crown, against whom the rebellion was going to be now waged, Lord Dunmore, invited black people to join. And it is subsequent to his invitation to black people to join that Washington eventually reconsidered his position. And it so turns out that at the end of the war, as studies have shown, 20% of the victorious army would in fact be black. So exactly proportionate to their percentage of the population. All right. Now, the most interesting thing that he points out is about the draft of the Declaration of Independence. And once again, of course, there are dozens, in fact, I should say hundreds of detailed studies done of the Declaration of Independence. So it's quite certain that the people who have actually looked at the Declaration of Independence are obviously well aware of this. But nonetheless, I think that that what Wilkins tells us here is really remarkable, that there is in the draft of the Declaration, which was subsequently abandoned, we find the following. This was the charge that was leveled against the king. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people. These distant people are African people brought over to the colonies as slaves, right? Who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. The Middle Passage. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Right? So his charge is that the king and the king's officers have promoted this most inhuman form of transportation of people from Africa into the colonies and bound these people into slavery, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms against us. This goes back to what I referred to when I said that Lord Dunmore invited black people to join, right? The army of the crown, and so on. Now, this passage, as Wilkins pointed out, did not make it through the editing process. It did not survive the cutting board. And for Wilkins, this is important because he wants to suggest that Jefferson was sensitive to the question of slavery, that eventually he could not disown slavery because he kept slaves. At the time that he wrote the Declaration of Independence, when he finished the Declaration of Independence, he was 33 years old, and Jefferson owned 100 slaves. He owned 100 slaves. Right? Now, from there, Wilkins goes on to have another a discussion of the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Again, a brief discussion because there are far lengthier treatments of all of this and scholarly studies. And this book does not really purport to be a scholarly book as such. It's written by a person who has played an important role in the civic life of this country, an African-American who comes from a very distinguished family. He's professor of history at George Mason University, has served in various kinds of positions, such as a member of the school board of the District of Columbia, right? But as I said, there are other people in the family who have been distinguished members, distinguished in various spheres of life, related to Roy Wilkins, of course, as well. And one of the things that Wilkins points out now is that at the Constitutional Convention, South Carolina raised an objection. Now, you might remember that in the Articles of Confederation, a black person was counted as 3/5 of a person. So South Carolina, during the constitutional debates, the Constitutional Convention debates, said that a black person should be counted, each black person should be counted as one person, just like white people. And this sounds very surprising coming from South Carolina, given the reputation that South Carolina has had for well over 200 years as one of the great bastions of slavery, and now as one of the great bastions of a certain kind of political conservatism. Except, as Wilkins points out, this was, of course, simply a ploy. It was a ploy because it was not that South Carolina was really, now suddenly interested in the welfare of the black person, but rather, of course, because South Carolina had a large slave population. And therefore, South Carolina figured that it would have a much greater role to play with respect to the question of representation. That if the number of seats that a state is given in Congress has to do, of course, with the population of the state, then it stands to reason that a state such as South Carolina would benefit immensely, since it had a large black population. The intent here was not to give black people rights when South Carolina made this intervention. But in any case, this was not carried, although there was a lot of discussion about slavery, and slavery was going to be permitted. That was the agreement until 1808. There was also the provision that no protection for slaves was going to be available. The slaves, that is, who fled to a free state. Right? So if a state went from a slave-owning state to a free state, the slave owner could send people to catch the slave, and they would have no protection. Right? So these are the kinds of things that Wilkins really discusses. And he's also interested in trying to understand the relationship between Jefferson, Mason, Washington, and eventually Madison. But that's a subject that I will skip here for the moment, because I now want to move finally to the last portion of the book, where his focus really shifts to the slave. How did the slave cope? All right? Well, there were two fundamental ways in which the slave attempted to cope with his or her situation. One was, of course, outright rebellion. The risk of this outright rebellion was overwhelming white power that the rebels would have to face, which is one reason why slave rebellions were crushed. Because white people not simply had overwhelming power, they repeatedly showed that they were prepared to use that power. Right? The second strategy of coping was to try to ensnare the master in a web of reciprocal obligations that would create some kind of free living space, the space just to breathe, really. Right? That is, of course, the fundamental way in which slaves attempted to cope. We shouldn't underestimate how many rebellions there were. I think there's increasing awareness of the fact that there were a large number of slave rebellions, some very small, and there were some much larger. And of course, there were lots of runaway slaves. And we know that runaway slaves were treated really brutally. But one thing that, of course, slaves knew were that if they were captured, that it was still in the interest of the slave owner to keep that person alive, because every slave that was dead was a slice of property that the white slave owner had been deprived of. Right? And of course, the slave owner couldn't hold out the threat that I'm going to increase the punishment for you, because a slave was a slave for life. In most cases, of course, some slaves were able to eventually buy their freedom, and some, a very small number, had the good fortune of being owned by slave owners who adopted a different position at some point in their life. But that was, again, a very, very small number of slaves who could actually benefit from a disposition of that kind. Right? So Wilkins begins his discussion of the particular ways in which slaves attempted to cope. And he says that we can speak about kind slave owners, but there is something that seems inauthentic in speaking about the kindness of a particular slave owner. It is, as he's suggesting, something of a stretch. And if not all slaves were blameless, he writes on page 97, neither were all masters utterly evil. They were kind masters, though kindness in the context of such a heinous criminal enterprise as American slavery must necessarily have a rather shallow meaning. And I think that this would necessitate a long discussion, which would be proper at a different moment. And that would be certainly a discussion about what do we infer about the relationship between the master and the slave, a subject on which, of course, a huge amount has been written. And can we describe this relationship as a relationship which was not simply one of domination on the one hand and submission on the other hand? And of course, the most common way, it seems to me, that scholars in particular have sought to suggest that there are many other ways of seeing it is to look at, for instance, everyday acts of resistance. Small acts of resistance, sometimes imperceptible. Right? And I'm always reminded here of something I read by George Orwell 35, 40 years ago. It's a small book of his called Down and Out in London and Paris. That's the exact title of the book. And he describes how when he was a young man, he was working in these restaurants as a waiter. Now, Orwell always thought of himself as someone who was far more educated, far more enlightened, really, a person of, let's say, far-reaching political views, someone who was reflective. And when he served as a waiter at these restaurants, some expensive restaurants where people came in who had lots of money, but from Orwell's standpoint were really dim-witted, he burned inside. He felt enraged. He felt humiliated that he was dishing out a bowl of soup to them. And so he says that sometimes what he would do is he would spit in the soup before he served it. They might not know it, but it gave him some pleasure. Right? So there are lots of different ways in which we can think about the relationship between the master and the slave. Right? And then Wilkins continues to sort of now discuss sort of the life of the slave, but he brings Washington, Madison back into the picture, right? But prefaces it with the broader observation that you can see in the literature over times that, and of course in the conduct of white people for decades and centuries after that, for 150 years after that, and perhaps down to the present day, that the esteem of white people, their self-esteem, was simply flowing from the fact that they knew that they were not black, right? And of course, for Wilkins, the challenge is to understand how some white people rose above that, and then the further challenge is to understand how, as a black person, he can rise above this atrocious legacy. And this takes me back to the beginning of the book, because how does he begin the book? He begins the book by describing his visit to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., right? Where you have all of these lofty proclamations, and Wilkins is at the same time proclamations about the dignity of human beings, the right to liberty, to equality, to the pursuit of happiness. And not just passages from the Declaration of Independence, but passages from other writings of Thomas Jefferson as well. Because Thomas Jefferson was also a person who crafted a large number of other documents which express the same sentiments, including the Constitution of the State of Virginia. Right? And so this book is really a book about this tension between slavery and freedom, between black people and white people, but it's really also the tension within the white person. And then that a white person such as Jefferson, who knew in many ways that he had the freedom to read, write, reflect, think, study, because of the wealth that he had acquired in slaves, especially after the passing of his father-in-law. Right? But we don't have to be interested in the particularities of Jefferson, because what he's describing is the condition of people of Jefferson's class, that their freedom to do all of these things was enabled by slavery, right? But Wilkins wants to think through, at the end of the book, his own moral dilemma. Okay, and his own moral dilemma is, as a person of African background, how does he situate himself in relationship to all of this? Considering that Wilkins very much feels, as I said at the outset, an American. He feels very much like an American, right? So he says on page 142, and this takes us really to the last pages of the book. More than anything, though, I suppose I love the opportunity this nation affords me to engage in struggles for decency. That, in my view, is the greatest legacy of the founders. Now, I think that it behooves us to not be wholly impatient with him at this point, because I can envision an activist of BLM reading this and saying, "Oh, I've heard this humbug before." I think that we have to be patient. Wilkins is himself an African-American man. He's quite reflective. He's learned. He has made a serious attempt to engage with the thought of the founding fathers, with the social and political practices of those days, with the history of slavery, right? And so he's not speaking from the standpoint of someone who is simply saying, well, there is a narrative of American exceptionalism, and I am subscribed to that. Right? I think that this is why this book caught my attention, because I wonder how someone like him can feel so strongly as an American. That is not really resolved for me in this book. So he says, again on page 143, in my view, we have created much good. There is clearly much more to be done, and there will always be. This sounds like Barack Obama or thousands of others as well. But it is deeply American to aspire to make things better. Is it only deeply American to aspire to do that? Or is it deeply human? Is the American more inclined to make things better because the American is the product of a young society? And just as the elderly see the idealism of the young, do we also say that nations reflect the same kind of relationship? That older nations have become, and civilizations have become cynical, and the United States is still, practically speaking, a young country. I think that these are some of the reasons why I feel that a book like this still deserves some merit. Right? Referring to the sacrifices of his ancestors and the desegregation struggles of the 1950s, followed by, of course, what becomes known as the Civil Rights Movement, he says, I have had the great fortune to see and participate in astonishingly American effort to adjust life as it is lived to the ideals proclaimed by the founders. So I conclude with that, with the observation simply that I think this short book of something like 145, 150 pages, I think merits a close reading. And I only need to say one more thing, namely that for those of you who are wondering to yourself, what is Jefferson's pillow? Because that is the title of the book, Jefferson's Pillow. He tells you on page 136, I think he says that somewhere earlier as well, from his earliest memory of being carried on a pillow by one slave to the day he was lowered into the earth in a coffin made by another, Thomas Jefferson led a life cushioned by the subjugation of others. End quote. Thank you.